Get him out of here. Someone like that has no place stepping back into this base. A few soldiers glanced toward the man standing outside the fence, an old jacket, a small bag, his hand gripping a military keepsake. He only meant to return it and leave. But to Briggs, it was nothing less than a perfect chance to make sure the past would never come back. But a moment later, Briggs stopped when the man lifted his head. That calm, chilling gaze, familiar in a way Briggs hated to remember. It wasn't the look of a drifter, nor of someone erased from the unit. It was the look that once sat behind an Apache cockpit. His appearance cracked the thing Briggs had kept intact for 10 years. Because at the base gate now, only two people knew what really happened in the accident back then. One who wanted to forget it, and one who never had the chance to speak. When someone stands still after 10 years of silence, what comes next is either the truth or another burial of it. If this story makes you stop and think, hit subscribe and leave a comment. This is only the first door to the truth. Morning at Fort Irwin began with the familiar movements of a base preparing for a major event. The early air was still cool, sunlight had only brushed the ground, and soldiers and technicians were already moving quickly through their usual routines. The honor guard gathered at the airfield, each person adjusting position on command. Even with the tension in the background, no one questioned anything. Everyone understood this was the day Apache would be presented to the media, senior officers, and veterans. A day when every movement had to be exact. Major Briggs stepped into the practice area. His expression was more serious than usual. When he saw the honor guard moving slightly off rhythm, Briggs stopped in front of them and said, his voice clearer and louder than usual, "No improvising. I want to see exactly what we practiced." The formation corrected itself at once. They knew Briggs didn't ask for much, but anything he said had to be followed immediately. A young officer holding the program sheet approached, asking nervously, "Sir, for the memorial segment, do we need an added introduction? Media wants a highlight." Briggs didn't look at him, his eyes still fixed on the formation ahead. "We follow the approved program. No additions, no cuts." His voice wasn't harsh, but it carried enough weight for the officer to leave at once. Briggs continued toward the display area, where the Apache helicopters were being polished down to their smallest details. A technician had just finished checking a maintenance board and had left part of it exposed at the edge. Briggs caught it, turned back, and said, "Take that away. This isn't where we leave documents out." The technician quickly rolled the board up and pulled it inside. Everyone knew maintenance files weren't supposed to appear in front of the cameras today. As Briggs checked the rhythm of activity across the airfield, the radio on his belt sounded. A voice reported on outer security conditions. Briggs lifted the radio and answered, "If anything comes up, let me handle it. Don't let it become a problem." He always preferred to deal with disruptions himself, especially on a day he believed the base needed to show absolute stability. A group of young soldiers walked by. One of them murmured to another that today marked 10 years since the old Apache crash. Briggs heard it. He stopped and turned back. "Not something we mentioned today." The soldiers fell silent at once, as if they had touched something forbidden. Briggs didn't change expression as he walked on, but the air around them grew heavier. At the veteran reception area, guest lists had been printed on several sheets for Briggs to review. He marked in red the names that had confirmed and crossed out the lines without responses. When he saw a blank line, he crossed it out without hesitation. To Briggs, everything had to be clear. There was no room for uncertainty in this ceremony. Back at the center of the airfield, Briggs watched the technical teams preparing equipment, the media setting up their camera angles, and groups of soldiers adjusting their positions. His stance looked like the axis around which the entire operation turned. His control didn't come from loud orders but from his ability to keep every flow of activity aligned. He watched like someone long accustomed to ensuring a ceremony ran smoothly, without letting the past seep in. Gradually, the sunlight grew stronger, and the pace around the airfield quickened. The Apaches gleamed under the light. The rows of guest seats were adjusted for the last time, and the media support team tested the speakers at the stands. Briggs walked slowly between groups, checking every detail from flag placement to the sound system's position. He didn't need to correct much. Everything had been prepared beforehand according to the standards he set. Briggs stopped at the center of the airfield again, looking around. Every movement was orderly, every sound within predicted limits. He felt everything was still held neatly in his hands. It was what he hoped for today, a ceremony with no gaps, no incidents, and no revival of anything that had once caused controversy. But when Briggs turned toward the base's main gate, he froze. There, in front of the checkpoint, a man stood alone. No officer was guiding him. He wasn't part of the guest line, and he wasn't on any list that had been reviewed. The man stood still, as if waiting for someone to call his name or trying to decide whether he should step inside. Briggs narrowed his eyes. The face wasn't clear from the distance, but the stance and the way the man held himself apart from the flow of people made Briggs feel something wasn't right. Among the organized movements of the ceremony, the presence of this man stood out like a misplaced point, a detail that didn't fit the order Briggs had spent the whole morning maintaining. He stood still for a moment, watching the man at the gate as if searching for an explanation, but the man didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't turn away, didn't fall into the rhythm of the bass. At that distance, Briggs understood he had just seen something he did not want to see on Apache Day, a sign of a past he believed had been buried long ago. At the gate of Fort Irwin, the flow of people moving in and out was checked more closely than usual. Security posts were busy with vehicles bearing unit plates, media staff wearing bright badges, and small groups of veterans waiting to complete their entry for the Apache anniversary ceremony. The morning was still mild, the wind carrying the desert's familiar trace of sand, but the checkpoint itself was far from calm. Everyone understood this was the day the base had to maintain absolute strictness. In the middle of that orderly stream stood a figure separated from the crowd. Daniel Cross didn't step forward or call anyone. He simply stood at the outer edge, holding a small bag. His eyes didn't linger on anyone. He looked like a man waiting for the exact moment to finish something, then leave before anyone could ask a question. The faded, old military ID he presented only made him more out of place in a setting that was so tightly controlled. A security staffer stopped in front of Cross and took the card. He held it up to the light to read the worn print, then said politely, "This card expired a long time ago, sir." His tone carried no accusation, only a simple fact. The man standing before him no longer belonged to the military. Cross nodded, his voice low and steady. "I know, I just want to return something and leave." He raised the small bag slightly so the guard could see what he meant. No long explanation, no attempt to move deeper into the restricted area. Everything about Cross suggested he didn't plan to stay here any longer than necessary. The guard hesitated. Nothing Cross said was suspicious, but the situation didn't fit any routine procedure. He turned, ready to seek guidance, and saw Major Briggs walking toward the gate. Briggs had come to check the incoming crowd before the ceremony began, but when he saw Cross, his steps faltered for a brief moment that wasn't easy to notice. Even that single pause was enough to show Briggs recognized the man standing at the edge of the gate, even after a decade had stretched between them. Briggs approached, his eyes sweeping over Cross from head to toe, as if confirming his memory. When he stopped in front of him, he asked, "Why did you come back to the base?" The words weren't loud, but they carried pressure, as if Cross's appearance from the start was something Briggs wanted removed from the morning. Cross met Briggs's eyes and answered slowly, "There are a few things that belong to the unit. I kept them when I shouldn't have." His tone was calm, not confrontational. The meaning was simple, yet the way Cross said it made it impossible for Briggs to dismiss. Briggs looked at the bag in Cross's hand, then back at his face. His lip curved slightly, a brief smile sharp as a thin blade. "Usually, people who leave this place don't need to come back," he said, half remark, half warning, a reminder that Cross was no longer part of the ranks and that his return was not welcome. Cross didn't respond. His silence only irritated Briggs more. Briggs turned to the nearby guard and said with the certainty of someone issuing a familiar order, "Hold him here. I want to make sure everything is by the book." No explanation, no further checks. Briggs wanted Cross's presence placed firmly under his control. The guard stepped closer, not to force him but to keep a tighter watch. Cross didn't move back or forward. He looked like someone with nothing to hide but no way to avoid scrutiny. A young officer near the reception tables happened to glance over. His eyes stayed on Cross longer than expected, as if trying to recall something. Then he stepped toward Briggs and lowered his voice. "Sir, is he the former Apache pilot?" His tone was unsure, but it was clear Cross's story hadn't completely vanished from the memories passed down through earlier training cycles. Briggs shot the young officer a look that was enough to silence him. Then he turned back to Cross with an unreadable expression. This situation was outside the plan, and Briggs wasn't someone who welcomed surprises. He wanted the morning to unfold exactly as arranged, not a single beat out of place. Cross remained as calm as he had been since he appeared. His silence made everything heavier. Briggs stepped closer, just enough to narrow the distance. His voice dropped, colder now. "You remember why you left, don't you?" The space around the gate fell silent after that question. The guard looked from Briggs to Cross, aware he was witnessing something far beyond routine duty. The young officer stepped back slightly, feeling as if he were standing near a crack that had never been repaired. The engines from the airfield sounded in the distance, but here the air was still enough to hear wind brushing the metal fence. Cross looked straight at Briggs but didn't reply yet, and in the split between Briggs's question and Cross's silence, the moment thickened, telling everyone nearby that this was no longer a simple checkpoint interaction. The first sign of the past Briggs didn't want to face had appeared at the gates of Fort Irwin, on the very day he had worked so hard to keep everything perfectly stable. The news that Cross had appeared at the base gate made Briggs feel as if he had stepped back into a period he had always wanted to lock away. From that moment, memories of the years they served together in the Apache unit pulled sharply into focus, clearer than any reports Briggs relied on. Cross had never been like the other pilots, and Briggs wasn't like any commander Cross had dealt with. They served in the same team and went through the same demanding Apache readiness drills, but they never stood on the same line when it came to how they saw their duties. During his service, Cross was always the first person in the briefing room each morning before assignments were handed out. He reviewed the map, read the weather notes closely, and even checked minor details outside the usual template. To Cross, a flight wasn't contained in the words and numbers on a report. He believed no report could fully reflect what waited out there. If the wind shifted oddly, if there was a faint burnt smell on the fuselage, or if the rotor lagged a second, Cross noticed. He didn't see those as hunches but as real signals. Briggs stood on the opposite side of that thinking. He trusted complete files, signed checklists, and procedures set by higher command. He often said in briefings that a mission only succeeded when everyone followed what was laid out. To Briggs, the system existed to protect people, and those inside it had to fit it. In an important meeting, the commander placed the situation report on the table and asked Cross, "If it were you, how would you assess this mission?" Cross looked at the map, then at the numbers showing wind density and pressure changes, and after a moment said, "There are a few conditions out there the report doesn't fully reflect." The sentence made several people turn toward him, since few dared make that kind of assessment once the technical report had been approved. Briggs cut in immediately, his voice rigid. "The report has already been thoroughly reviewed." He spoke as if Cross's comment were a scratch that needed to be wiped clean before it spread. Cross turned to Briggs, calm. "I'm not saying the report is wrong. I'm saying it isn't complete." His voice stayed even, but the statement drew a sharp line between them. One believed in what was written, the other believed in what waited in the sky. Both men existed in the same team, but to Briggs, only one type fit the order he built. After the meeting, Briggs followed Cross as people were leaving the room. "You're making things more complicated than they need to be," he said. His tone had shifted from directive to warning. To Briggs, Cross was touching things that shouldn't be touched. Cross turned back, still composed. "When a flight feels too smooth, that usually means something's wrong." He said it like stating a rule any pilot knew, yet one often ignored when paperwork showed the opposite. Briggs didn't answer immediately, because that line held something he didn't want to acknowledge. Reality sometimes outweighed the system. Another pilot, who had flown wing with Cross on several missions, passed by and whispered to a teammate, "Cross spots trouble before it becomes a number." Comments like that spread through the unit, and many respected his ability, but Briggs never saw it as a strength. To him, someone who saw too much too early could slip out of discipline. The contrast between Briggs and Cross sharpened as missions grew more complex. While Briggs wanted everyone to follow the objectives on paper, Cross looked at the field and saw changes no map or data sheet could capture. If Cross noticed anything odd on the aircraft, he immediately asked for another check. If he sensed a wind shift even when reports listed stable conditions, he repeated the warning before takeoff. He lived by the principle that anything that could go wrong needed to be considered before leaving the ground. Briggs always said missions required trust in procedure. He wanted every member to act according to what had been approved, because in his view, rules existed to keep the unit unified. Anyone who asked too many questions became someone who disrupted order. The tension between them never exploded in big arguments. It surfaced in opposing comments, in glances that never aligned, and in briefings where Cross's opinions were always treated by Briggs as obstacles. Briggs didn't dislike Cross personally. He disliked what Cross represented: instinct and field awareness, things not in a file, not signature approved, and impossible to enter into a report. Many in the unit noticed the difference, but never said so aloud. They knew someone like Cross could save them on a mission because he sensed danger early. However, they also understood that Briggs's career depended on staying within the lines, and when two people stood on opposite ends of thought, collision was inevitable. A pilot who had worked with Briggs for years once told a colleague during lunch that the difference between them was like two metal plates grinding against each other. The longer it continued, the hotter it would get, and no one knew which mission would be the one where the heat finally showed. Then unannounced afternoon, command sent down an internal message. A major training mission would take place the next morning. The notice listed the time, the participating teams, and the flight area. But what caught everyone's attention was the final note. It was completely blank, no postponement options, no backup plan. Briggs looked at the message with satisfaction. He preferred missions like that, clean and straightforward. But those who had flown with Cross knew that a mission without postponement meant the entire team had to depend completely on maintenance logs and weather reports, leaving no room for field instinct. And that was when the contrast between Briggs and Cross began turning into something that would lead to an outcome no one expected. The mission was issued in silence, carrying expectations and a deep sense of unease. The morning of the mission unfolded with the familiar urgency of an important training day. The technical area bustled with the sound of engine checks, the sound of tools being pulled, and the hurried exchanges between technicians. Early sunlight spread across the Apache bodies parked in the lot, but no one paid attention to the beauty of that scene. Everyone focused on the work ahead, because training flights always carried a pressure not spoken out loud. In that atmosphere, Cross walked straight to the maintenance records area for a final check, a habit he had maintained since his first days holding the controls. He opened the file, his eyes moving quickly across the lines of data recorded from the previous shift. Everything looked normal until Cross noticed one notation that had been adjusted. The number had been changed slightly, but for a pilot like him, every detail could become the deciding point between safety and accident. He pointed at that line, his voice clear. This line was changed after the last inspection. I need to confirm it again. Briggs was standing at the aircraft hangar door, observing the whole team preparing. When he heard Cross speak, he stepped over, his eyes glancing across the file as if what Cross pointed out was not worth concern. He answered immediately, without needing to think. The technical team already took responsibility for that. Briggs spoke with the tone of someone who believed that if a process had been signed, then the problem had been resolved. He did not want to repeat the old argument about trusting the records or trusting individual perception. Cross still held the file in his hand, his eyes not leaving the number that had been adjusted. I'm the one who has to take responsibility in the air, he said, slowly but firmly. If the Apache had a malfunction while at an altitude where no one could intervene, then he, not anyone else, would have to handle it. Cross wasn't speaking to stall time. He was speaking to remind Briggs that the consequences of ignoring details could be greater than what the reports showed. Briggs looked at his watch, impatience clearly showing on his face. He didn't want the mission delayed right before takeoff time, especially when this was an important mission carefully approved on schedule. His voice grew tight. We don't have time for this. It wasn't because Briggs wanted to impose control, but because he believed any delay loosened the unit's discipline. Cross set the file down, looked straight at Briggs, and said, "Time doesn't make this one safer." That wasn't an objection but a reminder of a reality that couldn't be overlooked. Briggs could push the pace, but the aircraft couldn't adjust itself to his clock. Briggs didn't answer that. He gestured for the technical team to continue with the preparation process. At that moment, Lieutenant Ethan Hale stepped toward Cross. Hale was the one who would fly with him on this mission. His face was much younger than Cross's, but his eyes showed complete trust in the experienced pilot. Hale stopped, looking at Cross as if waiting for a final decision, as if just one word from Cross to postpone would be enough for him to follow. The moment between them went quiet for a second. Cross looked at Hale, looked at the Apache behind them, looked at the metal joints that had been with him through so many years. He sensed things clearly in the air, like the slight rotor misalignment he once heard before an incident. But between that feeling and the approved takeoff order, only one choice was allowed to happen. Cross took a deep breath. The tension pressed along his spine like an invisible weight. Then he said, "Prepare for takeoff." Hale nodded firmly, shifting instantly into readiness. He didn't argue because he believed in Cross, believed that if Cross accepted to fly, then he had already weighed everything. Briggs heard that decision from a distance. He didn't say anything more. In his view, everything was going in the right direction. The mission stayed unchanged, the lineup untouched, the report undisturbed. To Briggs, that meant order was preserved. He turned toward the ground support team and ordered them to bring the Apache to the runway. Cross stepped toward the familiar helicopter. He placed his hand on the fuselage the way he always did before each flight. That gesture wasn't to check anything, but to sense whether any instability revealed itself through the metal. And this time, it felt colder than usual. Hale climbed into the rear cockpit, his eyes still watching Cross, as if waiting for reassurance. But Cross only nodded. The rotor began to turn. The air around them vibrated. Cross heard the familiar sound, but under that sound was a slight irregular beat, like the echo of maintenance that hadn't been clarified. He kept his gaze steady, not letting it affect the takeoff preparation. The technical crew cleared the area, and Briggs stood farther away watching the Apache from beginning to end, his eyes showing the expectation of a flawless flight. Cross placed his hand on the control stick and initiated the takeoff sequence. Hale checked the numbers again. Everything was within the allowed range, but inside Cross, unease settled like a thin layer of dust that no one but him could see. Briggs could trust the records. Cross had to trust his own instinct, and that instinct was pushing him toward an uncomfortable line. The Apache lifted from the ground, vibrating slightly as it broke free from the pad. Wind swept across the spinning blades, creating a sound blended between metal and aerodynamics. From below, it looked completely normal, just like hundreds of training hours before. But inside the cockpit, Cross felt every small movement, every vibration, every sound that fell outside the rhythm. The Apache rose off the ground in conditions that Cross did not feel safe about. The sound of wind screaming around the aircraft's body was the last sound Cross clearly remembered before everything blended into a thick, solid darkness. The Apache plunged downward as if the sky itself had closed above them. The horizon flipped, the ground surged upward, and the moment between life and death was compressed into a single dry crack echoing from the helicopter's frame. Cross didn't have time to look toward Hale, didn't have time to say anything else before the impact force knocked every sensation out of his body. When Cross opened his eyes, the white ceiling of a hospital room flooded his vision. The dim, glaring lights, the IV line brushing against his arm, and the smell of disinfectant slowed his breathing. His body ached as if every muscle fiber were being tightened. There were footsteps at the end of the room, the sound of military boots striking the floor, but Cross didn't pay attention. The first thing that came out of his mouth, hoarse like a voice pulled from a deep well, was the question, "Where is Hale?" The nurse pressed her lips together when she heard that name. She didn't answer directly but only said, "The officer in charge will come speak to you." The reply didn't contain information, but her avoidance was enough for Cross to sense the worst. Hale was gone. No confirmation needed. The silence in the room was heavier evidence than any explanation. Cross tried to turn his body, but the wounds made him wince. Every movement pushed against the chaotic fragments of memory. Each moment before the Apache fell, slashing back like shards of glass, he heard the rotor's uneven rhythm again, heard the offbeat vibration he had noticed before takeoff. Hale had looked at him then, his eyes waiting for a clear signal. Cross had said to take off. That truth stabbed into his chest when he realized he was the only one who woke up in this room. The hospital door opened. Briggs appeared with a face showing nothing except the weariness hidden beneath his usual sternness. He walked with two other officers, holding a thick file. Cross looked at him, his eyes dry but sharp enough to make Briggs pause half a second before stepping closer to the bed. Briggs placed the file on the table and said in an even voice, "We need you to look over the accident report. No condolences. No mention of Hale, no question about Cross's condition, only the file and the task that had to be completed." One officer opened the file and pushed it toward Cross as if placing a verdict into the hands of a guilty man. The sections were already filled out. The preliminary cause was listed as rotor imbalance due to field conditions, classified as a training risk, with no unusual maintenance factors. Cross read each line, each word, as if watching someone rewrite the entire truth. No line mentioned the altered maintenance detail, no suspicion, no reference to what he had sensed before takeoff. Cross lifted his eyes from the report, looked at Briggs, then at the file again, and said, "There are a few things not mentioned yet." The words weren't loud, but the room grew heavier at once. The two officers behind Briggs shifted slightly, waiting for his reaction. Briggs kept his voice steady, as if this were just a routine meeting. "Not every detail needs to be recorded." He spoke as if Cross were reading more than necessary, as if the truth should be trimmed to whatever kept the unit running smoothly. Cross looked directly at Briggs, his voice no louder than normal, but carrying the weight of someone who had just lost a partner. "There are details that keep people from coming back." The sentence made Briggs silent for a beat. His eyes flickered, but he quickly regained his cold expression, as if calculating what response suited a commander. Cross didn't look down at the report again. He knew these pages weren't written to find the real cause, but to close an incident. Hale was inside the number. The white light of the room didn't blur that fact. Briggs folded his arms, standing straight again, as if to end a conversation that had gone on longer than necessary. He said, in a nearly emotionless tone, "The report needs your signature to be completed." To Briggs, the accident already had a conclusion. The system needed the file sealed so it could move on. One signature was enough. Cross looked down at the table, at the neatly arranged words, designed to cover what he knew had happened. His breathing slowed. Pain physical and otherwise, tightened through every vein. He remembered the moment Hale looked at him before takeoff. He remembered Briggs saying they didn't have time to recheck the unusual detail. He remembered the engine's silence during the fall, and the cold of the earth when the helicopter frame hit the ground. And now Briggs stood here, wanting him to sign so the truth could be called by another name. Cross put his hand on the file, not to pick it up but to push it back toward Briggs. He said, his voice clearer than before, "I won't sign." The room dropped into a stillness so complete that the monitor's heartbeat beep could be heard faintly underneath. Briggs kept his posture, but his eyes narrowed slightly as if he could not believe what he had just heard. The two officers behind him did not move, waiting for the next command. Cross leaned back against the pillow, pain spreading through his body, but his voice remained steady. He refused to let Hale's death be buried under clean, polished sentences. This accident was not a training risk. It couldn't be called by another name to beautify a technical file or protect a procedure that had already been flawed before they took off. Briggs didn't respond immediately. His silence wasn't shock, but calculation, thinking through the next step. Cross's refusal meant the story would not close as quickly as he wanted. But Briggs wasn't someone who let emotion interfere. He understood the system was larger than any individual, and he knew there were many ways to force an event into the direction he intended. Cross watched Briggs, waiting for a reaction. Pain tightened in his chest, making each breath heavier, but his gaze stayed sharp, not because he was stronger now, but because he knew the truth needed to stay where it belonged, even if only one person was left to speak it. Under the white light of the hospital room, between Briggs's rigid uniform and Cross's exhausted breathing, an invisible boundary appeared. One side wanted to close, one side could not, and Cross's final words locked the door between them. "I won't sign." The decision not to sign the accident report made the atmosphere around Cross change clearly, even though no one said it aloud. In the days after he was discharged from the hospital, he was still required to stay at the base to complete procedures, but his presence became loose. The looks that followed him weren't exactly blame, nor pity, but more like people watching a door opening toward a direction they didn't dare step into. In the system, silence could be seen as agreement, and anyone who broke it was viewed as a link that didn't fit. Cross was called to the command room on an afternoon near the end of the week. The room he stepped into wasn't the one that once displayed campaign maps or recorded the unit's achievements, but a small meeting room separated behind the row of administrative offices. The door closed behind him, and the silence inside made him immediately realize this meeting wasn't meant for him to explain his viewpoint. A mid-level officer was already sitting there, his eyes not trying to appear friendly. He opened a file and spoke without looking at Cross for more than a few seconds. "You've been called in to hear a notification, not to argue." His voice was steady, as if this had been decided before Cross walked in. Cross stood straight, his hands behind his back in the habit of a soldier. "What notification?" The officer flipped through a few more pages, then read as if quoting directly from an approved document. "You are no longer suitable for the unit's current direction." No pause to let it sink in. No additional explanation. This line had been used for many other cases in the military, but this time, it drew a boundary, dividing Cross's life into two sides. Cross didn't object. He only asked quietly, specifically, "What did I do wrong?" He didn't expect to be defended, nor did he think the question would change the outcome, but he needed to hear what they wanted to hide behind the phrase, "not suitable." The officer closed the file and answered in a voice without change of tone. "Nothing wrong in terms of records." The reply was like the final knock on a door already open. It said the fault wasn't in the paperwork, in the fact that Cross refused to let an error become an approved truth, and that made him someone unpredictable in an environment that valued smoothness. Cross nodded. He said nothing more. The words in this room, even if stretched into a long meeting, would not change anything. The decision had arrived before the explanation. It came from a system that preferred everything closed, preferred the cleanliness of reports over the complexity of truth. After that brief meeting, Cross returned to the pilot's barracks. His room no longer had much in it, except a few personal belongings and mementos from flight training. He packed each item, folded his uniform, and put it into a small bag. People passing by his door stopped for a second, but no one spoke. Cross understood they weren't avoiding him. They were avoiding stepping into any story that might pull them near the line he had just crossed. At the end of the hallway, an old teammate looked at him, then turned away. He wanted to say something, maybe regret, maybe good luck, but words spoken in a place like this could be interpreted in too many ways. Silence became safer. When Cross walked out of the barracks, Briggs was standing at a distance, talking to a group of young officers who had just finished the monthly report. Briggs caught sight of Cross passing, but he didn't call out, didn't look longer than politeness required. In Briggs's view, the matter had been handled. The pilot who had questioned things was no longer in the system, and Briggs would be credited in the performance report for maintaining unit discipline during a difficult time. Those lines later would be written in a formal tone, describing Briggs as someone who maintained organizational stability in a sensitive period. That stability was paid for by a man who chose to stand with the truth instead of convenience. But that did not appear in any evaluation. Cross walked straight out of the housing area, carrying his small bag. There was no farewell, no send-off, no one walking behind him. The military often operated like a large machine, and when one part no longer fit, it was removed to ensure the system kept running smoothly. No noise, no emotion, no looking back. He left the base in the afternoon, the sun lowering toward the horizon, soft orange light settling on the Apache lot in the distance. Cross didn't look toward them. He had spent his youth flying, keeping those aircraft from falling, trusting the feel of each rotor vibration. But now, he knew he no longer belonged there. In the years that followed, Cross lived quietly. He didn't do anything drastically different, nor did he try to cling to the past. But inside him there remained an emptiness not easily filled, where Ethan Hale's name appeared every time he heard a helicopter engine echo from some distant base. He avoided mentioning the past, avoided talking about Briggs, and avoided the accident report from that day, not because he wanted to forget, but because he understood speaking the truth in a place that never accepted it would only exhaust him. Time pushed everything farther away. 1 year, then 3, then 5 passed. New Apaches were upgraded. Briggs continued to rise in rank. New generations of pilots came and went. Fort Irwin still operated, still trained, still held ceremonies as if no one had ever questioned a maintenance file that had kept a young pilot from returning. 10 years later, on a morning with soft golden sun, a man stood at the gate of Fort Irwin. His stance was calm, carrying only a small bag, like someone who didn't intend to stay long. The base gate still kept strict routines, vehicles were checked, and the line of people moved steadily. That man was Daniel Cross, after 10 years without setting foot in the place that had once been his whole life, and his return was about to stir a wind that would unsettle things believed to have been buried in the past. The atmosphere in the base after the morning security check became more lively as guests and media began arriving in greater numbers. But the area behind the airfield, where mid-level officers were doing their final review before the anniversary ceremony, carried a different feeling. A strange quiet covered the group standing in a cluster, and at the center of that attention was Briggs. Briggs stood beside 2 young officers and a logistics staff member, clearly talking about a subject in which he knew he held the advantage in every word. When he saw Cross being held nearby to wait for verification, Briggs didn't miss the opportunity. He raised his voice just enough for people around to hear. Not everyone who once flew Apache understands what discipline means. The line was spoken like a lesson, but in truth, it was an arrow pointed straight at Cross. Several officers turned their heads toward Cross. Not all of them knew who he was, but the name Cross had passed through files or rumors enough for them to pay attention. Briggs paused a moment to make sure his listeners understood whom he meant, then continued, his eyes glancing toward Cross. Some people refuse to fly according to orders, and everyone knows the consequences. That accusation rang out in the open space and immediately pulled silence toward it. A young officer nearby turned to Cross, his eyes filled with curiosity mixed with caution, as if waiting to see how the man being mentioned in such an unfriendly story would react. But Cross kept standing straight, his hands folded in front of him, his gaze not turning toward Briggs or anyone else. His silence compressed the air, as if that calmness itself pushed Briggs to continue shaping the conversation the way he wanted. Briggs shifted slightly to face more of the officers, his voice dropping and steady, like the closing statement of a meeting. We handled that matter cleanly, so the unit could move forward. The brief smile on his lips didn't show joy but seemed like a confirmation that the past had been arranged in the order he wanted. Ethan Hale's death, Cross's refusal to sign the report, and the quiet departure had all been sealed by him like a file, no longer needing review. The listeners didn't respond. The tension in the air began to show clearly. Some wanted to look at Cross to understand more. Others avoided that gaze because instinct warned them. This lay outside anything they should step into. Cross still stood motionless, offering no explanation, no counterwords. He let Briggs shape the story in one direction without inserting a single word. Briggs stepped closer. The distance now, small enough for the sharpness in his eyes to show, no longer hiding his intent to diminish the man before him. You should be grateful things were closed the way they were, Briggs said, emphasizing each word as if recalling the day Cross left the base in silence. To Briggs, Cross's departure without shaking the system had been a sort of blessing, a sign of knowing his place, something Briggs believed Cross had never understood. The atmosphere around them sank. A nearby officer coughed lightly to break the silence, but no one dared step into the conversation, stretched tight like a string. Those standing close avoided stepping too far back for fear of drawing notice, but also didn't dare stand too close and risk being pulled into a dialogue carrying so many layers of resentment. Cross drew a small breath, his eyes lowering toward the concrete, then lifting toward the sky where the presentation would take place. No words left his mouth. No one knew what Cross was thinking in that moment, but the silence carried more weight than any rebuttal. It made Briggs understand that Cross had no interest in stepping into a verbal trap, giving him no reason to continue escalating this humiliation. To Cross, words couldn't change what had happened. The truth lay in the technical flaw, in the uneven rotor sound, in the moment Hale lost contact before the Apache fell. Nothing Briggs said could cover that with a new layer. Briggs noticed the silence, but wasn't satisfied. He wanted Cross to react, to be shaken, to give him a sign that power was still in his hands. What Briggs said in front of everyone wasn't to recount events but to ensure Cross understood his position here had never been equal and never would be. Just as Briggs was about to say something more, a hurried sound came from the auxiliary runway. A technical officer ran toward them with an urgency rarely seen on a ceremony day, his face flushed from running under the sun, his breath broken, as if holding news that couldn't be delayed. He stopped in front of Briggs, glanced at Cross for a second, then said, with forced calm, "Sir, there's urgent news from the technical area." That moment cut through the tension between Briggs and Cross like a blade. Those nearby turned toward the technical officer, understanding that urgent news at a moment like this was never something small. Briggs tightened his jaw, turned toward the man delivering the message, and no longer spared Cross even a second of attention. The story he had been using to belittle someone in public stopped abruptly when reality called him back to his rightful position. But its aftershocks, his words, the looks others cast at Cross remained, as if they had been driven into the air where no one could pull them out. Cross stood still, not looking after Briggs, not looking at the others. He felt a light wind pass across the airfield, carrying both the echo of humiliation and the shift in the situation, and that interruption was about to lead him into something Briggs could not fully control. The urgent news from the technical area forced Briggs to leave the unfinished conversation with Cross, but the irritation in his eyes still lingered as he turned away. Cross looked after him for a moment, then shifted his gaze to the wide airfield ahead. The atmosphere in the base seemed to change from the instant the technical officer appeared. Footsteps grew faster, voices became more rushed, and groups of personnel began moving with a rhythm unlike normal preparation. Briggs walked a few steps with the technical officer, then stopped to listen to the detailed report. From a distance, Cross could see Briggs's expression shift from irritation to tension. That made him realize something more important than the insults Briggs had thrown at him had just occurred. A medical staffer ran quickly from the operations building, her coat still marked with traces of disinfectant. She stopped before the group of officers and said rapidly, "The lead pilot can't fly." Her voice was urgent enough that everyone nearby paused for a second. That sentence spread like a wave. The staging crew looked at one another. The technical team grew unsettled, and the standby flight soldiers instinctively stood straighter. The lead demonstration pilot was the centerpiece of the ceremony, the one responsible for the entire sequence of tactical maneuvers before hundreds of people, including media, officials, and veterans. The ceremony depended almost entirely on this performance. A senior officer stepped forward, his voice unable to hide urgency. "Is there anyone who can replace him?" The instant the question was spoken, everyone turned to the technical team, as if they held the solution everyone hoped for. But the technical team looked at each other for a few seconds. Then the team leader said, "Only one person has flown this configuration in real conditions." The moment his voice ended, the atmosphere almost thickened. Everyone understood who that person was. Briggs spun around sharply, his voice hard as steel. "That won't happen." He spoke with the certainty of someone who believed that if he denied strongly enough, the suggestion would vanish from reality. But reality did not wait for Briggs. The technical officer checked the time, checked the preparation files, then looked at Briggs with caution that couldn't avoid the duty of speaking the truth. "Sir, we don't have any other option." He spoke slowly, each word weighted so it wouldn't sound like defiance, but the content could not be softened. The lead pilot was in the medical room, his body body no longer able to fly. The secondary pilots weren't trained for the specific Apache configuration used for the ceremony, and the time left to change the plan was almost zero. Briggs didn't answer right away. He looked around as if hoping someone would step forward and take responsibility in place of the name he didn't want to hear. But the silence from the technical team, the officers, and everyone nearby only made the single remaining choice clearer. Briggs turned, and his eyes landed directly on Cross, who still stood a few meters away. That look was cold enough to make a nearby soldier instinctively straighten his posture. Cross didn't react. He didn't step forward, didn't step away, didn't propose anything. He stood exactly as he had all morning, calm and quiet, as if he had seen this coming from the moment Briggs thought humiliating him would be enough to bury the past. A young officer next to Briggs swallowed hard, his eyes flicking toward Cross, then back to Briggs. Something in his expression resembled someone who understood the situation had become a story beyond individual authority. Briggs didn't want to hear Cross's name even one more time. He had spent 10 years erasing this man from reports, from lists, from circles of mention. But now, the ceremony was counting down by the minute. Dozens of officials had arrived. Media teams were preparing their equipment, and the entire unit was waiting for his signal. Briggs continued looking at Cross. That gaze wasn't merely irritation like in the morning. It had shifted into something close to hostility. If Cross hadn't appeared at the base gate that morning, Briggs wouldn't be standing at this crossroads. But Cross was standing there, at the right time, in the right place, as if the system itself were forcing Briggs to face the piece of memory he had tried to bury. For several seconds, no one spoke. The airfield wind passed through the Apache's idle blades, carrying dust and the murmur from the stands. The silence stretched long enough to become pressure. Briggs drew a slow breath. He knew Cross well enough to know he would not volunteer to fly. Cross didn't want to step into a system that had rejected him, nor did he want to give Briggs an excuse to claim he was trying to return. That silence from Cross only tightened Briggs's frustration. If Cross volunteered, Briggs would refuse. But Cross said nothing, and Briggs found himself pushed to the edge with no retreat. Briggs turned to the nearest security team. The anger inside him sharpened like a blade, and he spoke the order that made the entire airfield freeze. Escort him out of the area. A murmur rose, not because the order was hard to understand, but because everyone realized Briggs was reacting not according to mission logic, but according to his own emotions. Two security personnel stepped toward Cross, hesitating with every step. They understood Cross had done nothing wrong. They understood he was the only person who could take the Apache into the air in the next few minutes. But they also understood an order was an order. Cross looked at them, his eyes showing neither fear nor resistance. He simply stood there, just as he had when Briggs humiliated him, just as he had when he was held at the gate. His stillness only made the security personnel more uncertain, as if they were trying to convince themselves they were acting correctly. Those nearby watched with an emotion hard to name. In that moment, they didn't see a conflict between a commander and a man expelled from the ranks. They saw something larger, the deadlock of a unit needing a pilot whose commander wanted to erase him. And everyone understood that if Briggs truly escorted Cross away, the ceremony risked collapsing right before them. But Briggs didn't care about that in the moment he gave the order. He wanted Cross gone from this place, just as he had wanted him gone from the unit's history. The two security officers reached Cross. No one knew what would happen in the next second. Briggs's order had just become the ignition point of the entire event. Just as Briggs finished speaking, the two security personnel were still standing in front of Cross, not daring to lay a hand on him. When a small sound rose from the far end of the technical corridor, the crowd instinctively parted, giving way to a group of senior officers approaching. The person in the center wore a neat uniform with a rank anyone would recognize even without seeing his face. Admiral Marshall stepped into the airfield area as if he had been summoned beforehand. His appearance changed the entire atmosphere instantly. The small conversations stopped. People who were walking paused for a few seconds. Young officers lifted their heads out of reflex, because an admiral never appeared in a technical zone unless the situation had crossed the bounds of normal operations. Briggs turned around immediately, his face flickering for a moment before returning to its usual sternness. He stood straight, his hands touching the trouser seams in the reflex of someone who had served many years, but his eyes could not hide the tension. Briggs didn't like being interrupted, and he liked even less being supervised in a situation he believed he had full authority to handle. Marshall stepped forward, glanced at Cross, then shifted his eyes to Briggs, asking directly, "What is happening here?" His voice was calm, but that calmness made every excuse Briggs might give feel thin as paper. Briggs answered quickly, as if wanting to seize the initiative. "An individual without authority is causing disruption. The wording was chosen carefully. No names, no old stories, only emphasis on Cross no longer belonging to the unit, as if that alone justified whatever action Briggs intended to take. Marshall didn't react immediately. He looked at Briggs for another second, then turned to Cross, standing a few steps away. Cross's expression didn't change. His gaze remained calm, just as it had when he heard Briggs insult him, just as when he was ordered to be escorted out. Marshall looked at him as if flipping through a file in his mind, then asked slowly, "Did you sign the report that year?" The question echoed across the airfield and startled a few young officers. Many had heard of the accident 10 years earlier, but none imagined that today, in the middle of the Apache anniversary ceremony, an admiral would ask that question with a voice that held no hesitation. Marshall didn't ask Briggs. He didn't ask the technical team. He asked the one person who had the right to answer with the truth. Cross looked at Marshall, his gaze unmoving. "No, sir." The answer froze the atmosphere for a beat. No one said anything. A person refusing to sign an accident report was far bigger than a procedural violation. It touched the core of the system responsibility and transparency. Cross had just confirmed an act every officer knew could destroy a career. Marshall turned back to Briggs, his voice still calm, but each word heavy, because he refused to cover a maintenance error. The brief conclusion cut through the wall Briggs had built to maintain his power for 10 years. Many eyes immediately shifted to Briggs, some confused, some doubtful, some suddenly connecting fragments they had once heard but never seen in any official file. Briggs lifted his eyebrows slightly, as if being forced into a conversation he had no intention of joining. He shrugged and replied with a tone that carried pre-calculated distance. "The military doesn't run on people who are too right." A graceful sentence, yet carrying a very clear attitude. Briggs didn't deny what Marshall said, nor did he confirm it. He shifted the weight back toward Cross, implying that principles, however noble, were not compatible with someone who wouldn't follow the structure. It was Briggs's way of saying the system needed smoothness, and people like Cross only disrupted its direction. No one added anything. Some stared at their boots, afraid of being dragged into a story beyond their rank. Others glanced at Cross as if seeing him for the first time behind all the rumors. A few technicians near the runway tightened their grip on their documents, realizing that truth spoken openly in front of this many people was rare in the military. Cross didn't respond to Briggs, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood this wasn't a debate that could change anyone's mind. He had refused to sign back then because he believed truth mattered more than clean paperwork. And now, with Marshall saying it aloud before everyone, he didn't feel victory or defeat. He only felt that a piece of truth had been placed in its rightful spot. Marshall stayed silent for a few more seconds. He looked at Cross, then at Briggs, like someone evaluating both not only through their words, but through the years of service he could see from his higher vantage point. Then he turned back and said in a deep, decisive voice, "I will decide this matter." Those 6 words made everyone lift their heads. It wasn't a threat, and not yet a judgment, but it was the declaration of the only person in the area with the authority to determine the entire situation. Briggs straightened further, but his eyes darkened slightly. The control he had held since morning had slipped from his hands. He was no longer the one controlling the narrative, no longer the one deciding whether Cross stayed or was removed, no longer the one defining truth in a way that benefited him. Marshall was now the one holding the key. Cross said nothing, but his eyes showed acceptance that this moment would decide everything that followed. The tension was so thick that people could hear only the wind blowing through the idle Apache blades. Everyone around stood still, knowing that from here on, the story no longer belonged to rumor, nor to the power of one man. It belonged to the decision of the Admiral, who had just stepped in and dragged the secret of 10 years into the open with a single question. And as Marshall stepped forward, preparing to give his next order, the entire area seemed to hold its breath. "I will decide this matter." The moment Marshall said he would decide everything made the airfield seem to freeze. Briggs kept his straight posture, but the expression on his face showed he was forcing down emotions he couldn't reveal in front of a superior. Cross stood a few steps away, calm to a degree that made those around him unsure what he was thinking. No one knew which way Marshall's decision would lean, but everyone understood this would not be a decision made on impulse. Marshall let the silence last a few more seconds before looking straight at Briggs, then shifting his gaze to Cross. He spoke clearly, each word striking with firmness. "Daniel Cross will perform the flight." The sound spread across the airfield like metal hitting metal, sharp and irreversible. A few people on the technical team looked at each other. Someone even exhaled in relief, because they knew that without Cross, the demonstration would almost certainly fail. The young officers near Briggs stiffened, none of them expecting the Admiral to make such a direct choice. Briggs stayed silent, but that silence was so heavy that people could see his fingers tightening visibly. Briggs protested immediately, as if Marshall had just broken an unspoken rule he had spent 10 years maintaining. He is no longer in the records. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the assertion that records not skill dictated who could operate within the military. Marshall didn't lift an eyebrow or change his expression, and he replied in a steady tone that made the line even sharper. Records don't fly, people do. No one could mistake the meaning. Regulations had value, but that value couldn't override the survival of the ceremony or the real capability of a pilot. The Apache demonstration needed someone who understood every vibration of the blades, every response of the system, and that person was standing right in front of them. Briggs slowly turned to his aide and received the flight authorization file. His hand tightened around the pen until his knuckles whitened. He signed on the required line like someone being forced to acknowledge something he had spent years denying. Each stroke was heavy, as if the signature stripped away a piece of the authority he had clung to for so long. When he returned the file to the aide, Briggs turned toward Cross. His eyes held a mix of irritation, warning, and a hint of bitterness. Briggs spoke coldly. "You're flying because no one else is left." Those standing nearby knew the sentence wasn't meant to give responsibility, but to strip away any sense of honor Cross might gain from Marshall's decision. Briggs continued, not lowering his voice. "If anything happens, the responsibility is yours." The line was placed like the last shield Briggs could build to protect himself. If Cross failed, Briggs already had an explanation. If Cross succeeded, Briggs would say it was a forced solution, not his choice. Either way, he wouldn't let Cross enter this story as the victor. Cross looked at Briggs for a moment, without rebuttal, without changing his expression. He said, "I understand." His voice carried no submission and no defiance. It was simply confirmation that he was ready for what lay ahead. That attitude made a few young officers look at him with quiet respect, because they saw he wasn't taking the mission to prove anything to Briggs, but because he refused to turn away from something he could do. Marshall gave Cross a brief look like a silent message, then turned away. He didn't need to say more. The order was given, and the rest belonged to the pilot who had once been removed from the system, and whom the system now needed more than anyone else. A light breeze swept through the airfield, carrying the sound of the Apache being readied for the demonstration. Cross took a deep breath. 10 years away from the sky, 10 years out of the cockpit, 10 years without touching the metal that had once been part of him. A technician approached and said carefully, "We'll reset the configuration to your usual setup." Cross nodded slightly. He didn't need to say much. Moving forward was enough for the technical team to know they were doing the right thing. Briggs watched Cross walk, a thin smile forming, not the smile of someone who had won or lost, but of someone who still believed higher orders couldn't erase his view of Cross. Yet deep in his eyes was a layer hard to read, like he was standing before a door to the past he wanted locked, only to see someone else open it. Cross walked through the technical area. The younger soldiers paused their work, watching him with unavoidable curiosity, mixed with respect. They had heard about the accident 10 years ago, about Cross's quiet departure, and they had just heard Admiral Marshall say aloud a truth they never knew. At the final few steps, Cross stood before the Apache. The metal surface reflected the strong sunlight, and the wind passing through the rotor gaps created a familiar sound. Any Apache pilot could recognize the correct rhythm of that vibration. And for Cross, it felt like the heartbeat of an old friend waiting for him. His hand touched the aircraft's body, cold, hard, but a sensation that brought every flying memory alive again. He looked into the cockpit and saw himself from years ago, saw Ethan Hale sitting beside him, saw every flight that carried them across night deserts, mountain ridges, and harsh training zones. The technician said, "Everything is ready, sir." Cross nodded. Behind him, Briggs stood still. He didn't call Cross back, didn't add another word, but his eyes followed each step as if witnessing fate itself circling back to confront him with the truth from 10 years before. Cross placed his hand on the cockpit frame. His breath deepened, grew heavier, not from fear, but because 10 years of waiting had condensed into a single moment. One more step, and he would sit in the seat Briggs believed he should never return to. One more step, and he would become what the ceremony needed to avoid collapse. One more step, and the entire past would try to follow. Cross moved toward the Apache for the first time in 10 years. Cross stood before the Apache as if standing before a life he had stored away in the drawer of memory long ago. The metal under the sunlight reflected into sharp streaks, like lines of memory flashing back without warning. The technical crew had already opened the cockpit door, and a few stepped back to give him space to approach. No one said anything, but that silence carried the weight of respect, worry, and a mixed anticipation. They knew he was the only choice, the only person who had ever flown the exact Apache configuration used for the ceremony, and they also knew Briggs was standing behind them, watching every movement like a man waiting for a single mistake so he could twist the story in his favor. Cross placed his hand on the cockpit edge, a small but decisive movement. At that moment, he felt a cold line run across his palm, a strange sensation after 10 years without touching what had once been an extension of his own body. He stepped one foot inside, then paused briefly before closing the canopy. That moment wasn't hesitation, but a silent farewell to the flights he had taken, and to the teammate who had never returned from the accident years ago. He lowered himself into the pilot seat, fastened the harness, feeling the seat embrace his back with a strangely familiar grip. The switches on the control panel sat exactly where his memory held them, only different in the thin layer of dust left from recent maintenance. Cross raised his hand, checking each parameter, moving across each system like someone rereading a piece of music that had rested too long in his mind. He spotted a small detail on the engine stabilizer bar, off by slightly more than the standard, though not enough to affect the flight. A technician nearby held his breath the instant he saw Cross lean down to adjust it. Cross didn't ask for assistance, didn't request approval, didn't explain. It was what he had always done, something no one on the base had ever forgotten. The control panel lit up, the rotor began to spin, and its sound made those on the ground sense the difference between the precision of someone who had lived with this machine and the tentative hands of pilots who only knew it through theory. The Apache shook once, lightly, then stabilized. Cross looked at the readings, his hand steady on the control stick, then exhaled slowly. The Apache left the ground, not abruptly, not with force, but smoothly, almost as though his own body was lifting it. In the first few seconds, no one below said a word. The technical team watched the auxiliary display on the ground, monitoring data streaming down from the aircraft. Every number appeared clean, steady, without deviation. No one dared break the silence with a comment, because all of them knew Briggs was standing behind them, observing without missing a single detail. Cross guided the Apache into its first arc, the nose tilted forward gently, the curve in the sky like a perfect brushstroke. Everything happened in exact rhythm, nothing excess, nothing missing. To distant spectators, there was nothing remarkable, because the flight was too smooth to reveal the technique behind it. But anyone who had ever flown an Apache knew that such stability didn't come naturally. It came from hands that could feel every vibration, every shift in pressure, every irregular wind pattern. The Apache climbed higher, then descended just enough to simulate the tactical scenario planned for the ceremony. These maneuvers were clearly defined, but when Cross executed them, they carried the precision of someone who had once used them in real missions, not simply a performance for an audience. Each turn, each blade tilt, held the imprint of a depth of experience no training manual could capture. On the ground, Briggs stood with a face that did not display emotion in any normal sense. At first glance, he looked focused on the demonstration, but those who knew him could see the tension tightening faintly along his jaw. Briggs did not want Cross to succeed, did not want to see him do what Briggs had denied for years, but he could not find an error. No strange noises, no irregular vibration, no signs of instability. The flight was unfolding with a perfection that felt almost insulting to Briggs. A young officer near him unconsciously murmured, "Beautiful angle shift." Briggs didn't turn, but his eyes cut sharply to the display in front of him. He didn't reprimand the officer, but that comment made his hands tighten behind his back. Briggs did not want anyone in the unit to see Cross as the best. That was the very thing he had spent a decade pushing away. As the Apache entered its final turn to prepare for landing, Cross felt his body merge with the aircraft's rhythm. He didn't think about Briggs, didn't think about the 10 years that had passed, didn't think about the truth Marshall had spoken aloud earlier. He thought only of each small input, of the safety of the machine under his control, and of the final responsibility he carried in a ceremony he hadn't even been invited to. The rotor slowed. The Apache lost altitude gradually. The wind beneath the aircraft blasted the ground, lifting dust into the air. When the landing gear touched down, the technical crew finally let themselves breathe. The Apache came to a stop perfectly, neither leaning left nor right, as if the ground and the machine had agreed on the meeting point beforehand. A few more seconds of silence stretched. No one dared break it with applause or excitement, because Briggs was standing behind them, but everyone knew the flight held no mistakes. Cross opened the canopy and stepped down lightly without looking toward the crowd. He wasn't waiting for praise, nor expecting anyone to approach. To Cross, Completing this flight wasn't about proving anything, it was simply not allowing the ceremony to collapse when he could prevent it. Briggs remained still. He didn't walk toward Cross, nor did he leave right away. Some officers glanced at him, waiting for a final reaction, but Briggs only turned toward the military clerks waiting for orders. His expression didn't shift, but his voice was cold enough to drop the air around him. His name will not be included in the report. A simple command, but enough for everyone to understand that Briggs would not let Cross be recognized as the one who saved the ceremony. And enough to show that even when the truth had been spoken, even when Cross had flown flawlessly, Briggs still chose to protect his own version of the story. The words fell onto the cement like the final pin locking shut every acknowledgement Cross might have received. And then Briggs walked away, leaving Cross standing beside the Apache, its metal still warm, in the afternoon sky that had just witnessed the final perfect flight of his life. After the ceremony, Fort Irwin quickly returned to its usual rhythm. The airfield was cleared, as if no major event had taken place. The technicians went back to their routine machinery work, and the young officers returned to their offices to finish their monthly reports. No one mentioned Cross's flight openly, and no one brought up the heated exchange between Briggs and Marshall. But that was the nature of the military. What wasn't written into documents would be pushed into the gray area, kept alive through whispered stories and glances that would never make it onto paper. A few weeks later, in that seemingly calm atmosphere, an internal review took place quietly. It wasn't loud, had no public announcement, and never appeared on the base notice board. Only those in the special inspection group knew the goal was to reopen the maintenance files connected to the accident 10 years earlier. Old folders were pulled from storage like ghosts returning from where they had been hidden. Each page was examined under white light, each record compared, and in that process, the review team found what Briggs had always feared. A maintenance report contained a modification. It was subtle, only a few altered words and numbers, but for someone who understood the process, the changes couldn't be dismissed as accidental. They had been made to justify that an Apache that didn't meet standards was still marked safe for the mission, and the altered entry fell exactly within the window before the fateful flight of Cross and Ethan Hale. The inspectors exchanged quiet looks. No one said Briggs's name, but they didn't need to. The chain of authority at that time showed that only one person could have made such a change without fear of cross-checks. The evidence wasn't enough for a court-martial, but it was enough to force the system to act in its own way. Briggs received his reassignment order on a morning swept with strong winds. The order came in a sealed envelope delivered directly to him by a liaison officer. Briggs opened it, read the first printed line, and his eyelid twitched. Despite the effort to keep his expression calm, the reassignment came with no explanation, no summary of the review's findings, no additional notes, only a location and a date to report for the new duty. A young officer standing nearby glanced over, lowering his voice when he saw where Briggs was being sent, the logistics station in Alaska. The area fell silent as the words landed. The Alaska Logistics Station was known as one of the most remote and punishing assignments. No combat units, no major ceremonies, no shine of command roles. It was where they sent officers no longer needed at the center of operations. Briggs folded the order slowly. He didn't protest, didn't request a meeting with superiors, didn't ask why. He only nodded to the messenger and signed the confirmation. The young officers watching didn't know what to feel. They had feared Briggs, respected his strictness, but the moment he quietly signed the order, made them realize that in this system, no one was truly untouchable. Briggs left the area without explaining anything to anyone. His calm was not acceptance but the reflex of someone long practiced at hiding emotion. He walked straight to his office, closed the door, and the room stayed silent until the afternoon. Meanwhile, life at the base continued. The ceremony was remembered through a few internal photos. Local news stations replayed the Apache demonstration as proof of a seamless event. No article mentioned Cross. No note acknowledged that someone who had left the service had saved the ceremony from collapsing. The system didn't record that truth because it didn't fit the story it wanted to tell. In another corner of the base, Cross packed his things in silence. He didn't have much, only a canvas bag with a few personal items and the old ID card he had brought to return on that fateful morning. After the flight, Marshall didn't hold him back or suggest he rejoin the military. Cross understood that the flight wasn't meant to open a new path. It was to close the 10 years he had carried a truth no one wanted to hear. When Cross walked out to the lot to leave the base, the airfield was already growing empty. The Apaches were being moved back into maintenance bays, the spectator stands were coming down, and the flagpole was being lowered after a long day. Cross passed them like passing objects that no longer belonged to him. He didn't look back at the Apache he had flown hours earlier. He knew if he did, the memories would pull him back toward years he had already had to leave behind. A young officer near the guard post recognized him. He seemed about to say something, but when he saw the calm in Cross's eyes, he only nodded in place of a goodbye. It was a small gesture, but sincere. Cross left Fort Irwin the same way he had left the military 10 years earlier. No escort, no ceremony, no voice calling after him. Only the footsteps of a man who had once stood inside a system, once trusted it, once sacrificed for it, then was pushed out because of a truth he could not swallow. Behind him, the base continued to operate, as if no one had ever disturbed its structure. New pilots trained, new officers added accomplishments to their records, and those who knew about the review kept the story behind closed doors. The system didn't apologize. It didn't correct itself with words. It only rearranged people to maintain what it called order. And in the late afternoon, as shadows stretched across the Mojave Desert, Daniel Cross walked away from Fort Irwin with the truth he had carried for 10 years. He had flown one last time, not to prove anything, not to rejoin the system, but to complete, once more, the responsibility of a pilot. Meanwhile, those who remained at the base continued calling their world by its old name, order. Daniel Cross's story shows us an important truth in any organization. The hardest thing isn't following orders, but having the courage to stand up when you know what you're being asked to do is wrong. Cross didn't seek glory or recognition. He simply refused to sign his name to a lie. But sometimes, one right decision is enough to cost you your career and your life. From that personal story comes a larger lesson for all of us. Truth can make the path lonely, but it's the only thing that lets you keep yourself intact. A system may not apologize, it may choose silence, but justice doesn't disappear, it just arrives quietly, without applause. It's also a reminder that in everyday life, when faced with injustice or wrongdoing, choosing silence can mean helping it along. Speaking up, even when it's hard, is the only way to change what should have been changed. If this story made you think, share it so more people can take something from it. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories.